people are at. That'd be nice.
Sure, Doc. Hi, everyone.
Oh, good. We did that then. Yeah.
Alrighty. So let me share my screen.
So we just had, for the recording purposes of recording, we've just had a welcome to country and a bit of a general overview of the previous Exploring Biodiesel events. So, and now over to Tash, just to explain how the Slido gig might work. So,
right. So on your screen at the moment, you should see a QR code that you can use your phone to scan that QR code and you'll log into slido.com. Or you can use your browser and go to slido.com and use the hashtag EBD5. Now we'll be asking a couple of questions to get you orientated with Slido, but you can also ask your questions to the speakers through Slido. So we'll start off with our first poll, which is, where are you joining us from today? Got quite a bit of spread there.
Okay.
Well, it looks like everybody's got it working, Jock. So back over to you.
All right, cool. Thanks, Tash. All right, we've got a bit of a spread, and I'm sort of sure that over time we get quite a lot more sort of involvement than what we've currently got, and that's a nice thing. So I'd just like to introduce Allen Schaeffer. I've bumped into Allen Schaeffer through the magic of LinkedIn, which joins people from all around the world mysteriously. Allen had some really good comments and really good recordings that's linked into obviously the area he works in, which is the Diesel Technology Forum. And I just want to, maybe Allen, we could just have a quick chat for a sec, just to sort of explain who you are and where things are, you know, how you've evolved to the position you are. So as Executive Director of the Diesel Technology Forum, what's your day-to-day life look like? Today's a good one, I gather.
Well, thank you so much, John, and everyone for having me. It's a delight to be with you. I have one foot into tomorrow already, so that's a great feeling from here. But the Diesel Forum, Technology Forum, we're a not-for-profit educational group. So a good part of my day is spent thinking about how the rest of the world is talking about diesel. We review a lot of news stories every day and look to try and set the record straight about the record of diesel technology and its emissions profile. We also do a fair amount of outreach and discussion with environmental groups and other stakeholders, truckers, farmers, harborcraft, watermen kind of folks, anybody that cares about diesel, that uses it or is interested in it, or could easily be part of our day. And today was kind of an interesting day because it was the first of 3 days worth of hearings for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on the future diesel engine emission standards that would be taking effect sometime as early as 2027. And it's the standards have not changed here in the U.S. since 2000. So it's quite a next big step for industry. And so we were part of that testifying before the EPA today, and you know, still basking in the afterglow of those 3 minutes that we had before our regulatory agencies. So that's our typical day is something along those lines. Pay a lot of attention to the news and what's going on in the world with energy and fuel prices and diesel and climate, of course. I think, you know, we represent companies that are trying to thread the needle between today's technology and tomorrow's opportunity. So we approach the challenge that we have that climate change is a serious issue. We need to work on addressing it the best we can. And there's a lot of solutions. And it so happens that diesel is one of them.
Yep.
So,
yeah, thanks, Al. And like so, you're sort of seeing that there's been enormous, and we'll probably cover this in your talk, but the diesel engine's come a long way from where it was. It seems to be the general theme that I picked up from the presentations. Just for everybody's information, if you do pop in and have a look at the Diesel Technology Forum website, you'll find Al talking to some of the serious players in the game. So you seem to have very good links into the big end of the industry, like the John Deeres and the Cumminses and the big tractor manufacturers. And so it seems a pretty nicely connected position that your group's got, Alan, as far as influence and understanding. So.
Yeah, we're somewhat unique in that we represent engine equipment and vehicle manufacturers, the OEMs, some of the key suppliers, the emissions control technology companies, the main engine component suppliers, companies like Bosch and Tenneco. And then we represent renewable fuel producers and petroleum fuel producers as well. So we sort of cover the diesel issue very holistically.
Mm-hmm. That's good. All right. So I know we've only got you for a certain amount of time this morning, but this is our morning. Just in case anybody's not aware, it's about coming up to 8 o'clock over in where Alan sits in the evening. So we're ahead. The Americans are behind. Yes. So I'll kick over to you, Alan. If you don't mind, you're happy to run through your sort of presentation and take questions at the end now? That'd be nice.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much. Let me get right to it then. Okay. How is that working?
It's looking good.
Yep. Okay. Very nice. Again, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I wanted to just spend a couple of quick seconds and tell you a little bit more about the organization I represent, and then a quick snapshot of the state of diesel technology, tell you about the policy trends and other things that are driving some of our discussions here in the US as well as on a global basis, and then really focus in on the opportunity we have with renewable fuels for leading us forward in sustainability and decarbonizing some key sectors of the economy. A quick word about us. DTF has been around since March of 2000. Our mission and vision are listed here on this slide. You can see that our range of vision is including things like championing energy conservation and environmental stewardship, and to enable worldwide economic growth through the transformation of clean diesel technology. So we have quite a big vision about what the organization does and who it represents. And I'll share maybe just a little bit more with you about the organization. What we do is we focus on areas on the left there in the red box, some of those key topics that are relevant for diesel and some of the policy discussions today. And we involve ourselves in various education, research, outreach, working with non-governmental organizations, and of course, our favorite friends, the media. So that is a bit of our portfolio of activities each day. The members of the forum, these are really the leaders in advanced technology engines, vehicles, and equipment. And we are delighted to represent them. You see their full list of icons here. So with that, let me just jump right into it. I like to kind of open up with a slide like this to put everything in perspective for us. Of where are we in this discussion, in this world of energy and climate change and policy? And we like to think of diesel as a technology that straddles the two worlds that we're in today. One of energy abundance, where we are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and in the case of the US, producing our own fossil fuels, our own crude oil and refined diesel products on a regular basis. But we also have one foot in the future, and that is the clean energy future that is defined as zero emissions using 100% renewable energy. So that's kind of where we find ourselves. And I think even all of us at home in our own worlds, we're thinking about the cars we drive, how we use energy, what fuels we're using, et cetera. And diesel is very interesting because it straddles both of those worlds very neatly. So it's important for where we are today, and it's also important for where we are in the future. As I think about the state of diesel, the slide here, this graph on the right sort of sums up the journey over the last couple of decades, really. We have mostly thought of diesel and defined it by its emissions. And here in the US, we have been on a journey to take diesel engine emissions down to near zero levels across all the different platforms and technology. And that has largely been accomplished. For highway trucks, those accomplishments were met in 2010. For off-road vehicles and agricultural equipment in specific, beginning in 2014. And these standards, of course, only apply to new engines and technology. Very important. And so it doesn't say anything about the legacy products out there in the different sectors. And as we go on through this discussion, you'll see how some of those things can become much more important. But I think we are, all working towards getting towards near zero emissions. And the way we work here is the setting of these standards is technology neutral. So the natural gas engines have to meet the same standard. The diesel has to meet the same standard. The spec fuel for certifying diesel engines is a fuel that can include some small amounts of biofuels as well. But that's really been the journey that has defined this industry for so many years. And we're now starting to pivot away from that a bit. And I will just maybe state the obvious. I think probably many of you on this call know this already, but diesel is really the technology that powers so many sectors of our global economy. And all these sectors listed here have some heavy reliance on diesel. The percentage numbers that you're seeing are based on US penetration rates, if you will. So more than 75% of all ag equipment here in the US is powered by diesel, and nearly all the largest machines and tractors are today. Same thing for construction, for goods movement, the trucks, the trains, the inland waterways, the passenger and vehicle ferries, really reliant on diesel. People movement here in the US, we're starting to experience more new technologies in this space. So 70% of all transit buses in the cities are diesel today. A good percentage of almost all the school buses are. Here's where we differ quite a bit, though, from folks in your part of the world. We only have about 1.5% of our personal vehicles that have diesel engines. And these are only available really in a few categories of vehicles. Pickup trucks, both the compact size, full size, and the heavy duty versions, some larger SUVs and some work vans and some passenger vans. So the U.S. is looking at really embracing diesel in light duty passenger vehicles back 10 years ago or so, and it never really panned out after some issues with emissions compliance, and the Volkswagen Dieselgate issue emerged. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and that sort of put the skids on any further growth for diesels here in the U.S. from a personal vehicle perspective. But it's still, diesel is the technology of choice in so many sectors in so many different ways. It'd really be hard to list them all. And so, do we see any of this changing anytime soon? We'll get to that, but for the most part, no. And so when we think about diesel, folks like to think about what does diesel do for you in your daily life? It brings the groceries to your store. If you call emergency help for emergency services, our 911 system, you're going to get some kind of diesel vehicle, et cetera. So we like to help folks recognize the value of diesel in all different sectors of our society today. And when we think about the journey that this technology has been on for the last 2 decades, it really evolved from the earliest time of 2000 is when we really started in earnest focusing on cleaning up diesel. And then over the course of the next decade, we did that through introducing cleaner petroleum diesel, the ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel. And that, of course, enabled particulate filters, selective catalytic reduction systems to be used. And that gets us to the 2010 milestone, where we really started shifting our thinking and concerns to more about efficiency and sustainability. And that really has carried us forward in the last decade as we think about how, where, and why diesel fits in a carbon-constrained future. So Sort of the entry into this conversation is having near zero emissions with the advanced emissions control technology, et cetera. If we did not have that, I would say we would be in a much more compromised position today. But because we have diesel that is so very clean and near zero emissions, and even more closer to zero coming in the future, that sets the stage for how can diesel really play in this sustainability and carbon constrained future that we anticipate. Another quick couple of stats from the US here, just to put it in perspective for you. Today we were doing our hearing with EPA, giving our testimony on future emissions standards for heavy duty vehicles. And you can see that 97% of our largest Class 8 trucks are powered by diesel. 50% of those are 2011 and newer model year. So they are all equipped with SCR and particulate filters. And that number has grown pretty consistently over the last handful of years. So we see a continued investment in that. And the benefits of those new technology vehicles, and again, this is running on ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, is shown here on the right. And that means the savings of 202 million tons of CO2, 27 million tons of NOx, and a considerable amount of fuel saved just the same. So the benefits of new technology that are being delivered to society, as well as those who are using the technology, are significant. And we try and think about those in interesting ways. That's one of the fun parts of our job here. So for example, we can say that all these new diesel trucks were the equivalent of removing the CO2 emissions from 43 million passenger vehicles from the road for a year, or making those all zero emission electric vehicles. Or it's equal to a wind farm with 42,000 turbines, about 5 times the size of the nation's capital here in the US, in Washington. So when we think about getting solutions for climate change and CO2 reduction, we encourage folks to think about, we should value all of these reductions, no matter where they come from or in what form. So using the most advanced diesel technology does deliver some pretty significant benefits. So let me focus a little bit more on the ag sector. I know that's one that you're particularly interested in. And we've already covered a number of the different aspects of diesel's role in the ag sector, and they're, I think, probably very much pretty aligned between our two countries. Not only in producing the feedstocks and the harvesting and planting of the crops, but transporting of the product, pumping of the water that's needed, and throughout the entire supply chain, diesel has a key role, whether it's moving the grain from the farm elevator to the grain storage facility, to the rail yard, to the inland waterway barge, and so on, and then ultimately to grocery stores around the country. So, the role of diesel in all this is very deeply intertwined. And, the diversity of applications using diesel is quite tremendous. All shapes and sizes, doing all kinds of work. And you're all familiar with many of these, and I'm sure you have some unique ones of your own. But from things that harvest very delicate crops, like tomatoes or strawberries, to some of the row crops and grains, to insilage, this is the work that diesel does every day. And so one of the things I like to even just level set everyone about, why are we talking about diesel? Why is this, that diesel is the dominant technology that it is today? And it's really for these reasons on this slide, which is this unique combination of features that insofar no other technology has been able to match. We've got a fuel with very high energy density, engines that deliver very high power density from burning that fuel, and they do it quite efficiently. They can operate for a long amount of time or travel a long distance before they need to be refueled. They have high degree of reliability and can last quite a long time. And sometimes the lasting a long time can be to our detriment in some ways. It also has a very available, established, and widespread parts, service, and fueling network. And this becomes very important as we start to think about diesel in the context of competing with some of the future technologies like electrification or hydrogen, for example. Diesel is a technology that's also, as we said, achieved near zero emissions. And the last point here is the one we're going to spend the rest of the time on, but that is the suitability of this technology to use renewable bio-based fuels is substantial. And so if we just look at the off-road sector for a second, you can see on the right-hand side here, this is a graph of showing how that sector of off-road equipment, and these are the larger machines, that have achieved near zero emissions, effective since 2014, now almost a decade. And just to put that in perspective, it would take 23 of today's diesel backhoes or kind of a medium-sized row crop tractor to equal the emissions of a single backhoe sold in 1997. So you start to get the sense that, wow, the technology has really changed over time, and that is exactly right. That value proposition is one that we have to also remind folks of on the on-highway side. We have over 140,000 stations in the U.S. that have diesel fuel available, and we have this whole deal with compatibility with these renewable and low carbon fuels. And there are some other attributes as folks are looking at different ways to decarbonize transportation, and particularly trucking gets into the mix there. So diesel is the value proposition is very hard to meet. As I like to say, it checks all the boxes of what people need today and what they're planning for in the future. Now, turning to that future, though, we all are understanding that some new fuels and technologies are emerging. And in particular for the ag sector, we know that diesel is the prevalent fuel today, but in the future, that's likely to change to some extent. And what are customers requiring in the ag space today? The same things that they've always required, which is I have to have fuel to do my work. I have to have fuel that's affordable. I have to have a way to run my machines and equipment to do my business, whether it's planting crops or harvesting, whatever it might be. So there's a whole range of requirements customers have and will continue to have in the future. But manufacturers and many of our members envision that some of these technologies or tractors and equipment that have relied on diesel in the past will start to see some diversification of fuel in the future. And from top to bottom here, you sort of get the sense of which ones are going to be the biggest players in that space. And the top couple that are getting a lot of traction here in the US are the renewable and biodiesel fuels, ethanol, of course, from the ag sector, biomethane and natural gas and renewable natural gas are emerging much more. And then there's some others that come in maybe more towards the bottom. But diesel, you can see, continues to exist in the future, even alongside of all these other fuels and technologies. And so what are the three things that are driving diesel forward today? And this is not just in the US, but globally. So first of all is greater efficiency. We're seeing a tremendous effort to make current diesel engines even more efficient. That's because of some new requirements here on our greenhouse gas requirements from EPA and the Department of Transportation are directing further improvements in fuel economy from heavy-duty vehicles. We're in the second phase of that now. It's happening. It's real savings for real truckers. And we're seeing some breakthrough kind of things. For example, just last fall, a joint industry government partnership known as SuperTruck achieved a 55% brake thermal efficiency in the laboratory. And that's a pretty significant accomplishment. And that means that 55% of the energy that's used in a diesel engine would be applied to useful work, as opposed to lost to heat or some other waste stream. And that's a major accomplishment. And considering that gasoline engines are in the 30s or so of brake thermal efficiency, it's a pretty big deal. So we are seeing continued investment to make the combustion process in diesel engines and vehicles more efficient. The second aspect of getting to the future is lower emissions. It's not good enough to be near to zero. We're going to be even nearer to zero, and that's coming in the not too distant future here in the US. And this may have some other ramifications on a global basis. And then lastly is these new fueling options. And so that is, how do we make the diesel engine better? And we know how we're doing that in the engine, but what about the fuel? The diesel fuel has not changed in the US since 2006, when ultra-low sulfur diesel was first introduced. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity on the fuel side here that we haven't fully realized yet. So let me spend the balance of the time talking about renewable fuels and give you some perspectives that we have here in the US on that. So why are people more interested today in renewable biodiesel fuel than ever before? And so I'll state some of the obvious, and I'll be interested in your comments and perspective on this as well. First and foremost is we are all part of the team to decarbonize our global economy and to attack the climate change challenge. And here in the US, our president has set a net zero carbon emissions by 2050 as a goal. And our transportation sector is now #1 in greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll show you some more data on that in just a second. And so not only has transportation emerged as a big part of the pie, but we also have, and federal policy is very clear at this point, we also have now a number of our states that are adopting their own goals. So for example, New York State has set their own goal of 85% reduction in greenhouse gases, and probably a dozen other states have done the same. So we're seeing a very activist policy climate here. We also have the influence that is growing throughout the world for our member companies, and that is the corporate environmental, social, and governance efforts, the ESG concerns, as we're starting to hear, as investors and public interests start to ask more questions about how specific businesses are managing the climate risk within their portfolio and how they're reducing their impact on the climate. That's going to become a more important part of the discussion here. And in the US, one of the most recent developments, our Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed rules that would require corporations to disclose all kinds of different information about their greenhouse gas reduction policies and risks to their business lines from climate change. So that's a proposal now that's getting a lot of attention and discussion, and that could have a very significant impact above and beyond any of these other things. The third reason that renewable and biofuels are becoming much more interesting is compliance with current policies. And here in the US, we have a renewable fuel standard that's been in place since 2005. It requires a growing body of renewable fuels be put into the fuel stream. So the compliance with that effectively dictates more renewable fuels every year. And the last two are ones that are more current of interest maybe. One is that the use of biodiesel and renewable diesel is increasingly viewed as an alternative for different users, for fleets, for farmers, for others who might decide that they would prefer a different kind of option other than being pushed towards electric or hydrogen or something that they may not be comfortable with, or frankly is not really available at scale or for what they need. So it is an alternative that they can begin doing something towards decarbonizing their sector. The last thing here, and the most recent one in present day, is using more biofuels mitigates the higher diesel fuel prices we're all experiencing because of some of the issues evolving out of the Ukraine, the war with Russia. So part of that is driving up energy prices, and diesel fuel is top of the list there. We're seeing diesel fuel here in the US at over $5 per gallon. It's the highest we've seen on record. So it's got a significant motivating factor there. So one of the solutions to that is to use more renewable fuels if you can. So these are the main motivating factors for getting folks towards renewable fuels. Just to share with you the activity at the state level, this gives you an interest in a very general kind of way on what policies are being put into place where. So we have in the West Coast, which is the most activist region, a low carbon fuel standard that dictates an increasing percentage of low carbon fuels be introduced into the mainstream fuel supply. And the way that refiners are complying with this requirement principally is through a lot of biodiesel and renewable diesel into the feedstock, into the fuel stream. And then you see some other initiatives here. You've got tax incentives in a number of states. You've got mandates to use renewable biodiesel for home heating oil. So we have an emerging quilt patch, if you will, of state activities and policies that will all demand more renewable biodiesel fuels in the future. I took a look at the Australia and US greenhouse gas inventories, and you all are a bit more timely in reporting your data than we are here in the US, but just as a kind of a side-by-side analysis, there's a lot of similarities that electric power generation creates the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions in both of our countries, running on the order of about a third of the CO2 emissions. Where we diverge, though, is on the transportation side. And you see that 35% of the CO2 emissions in the US come from transportation, whereas less than 20% in Australia do. So while we have some similarities on the electric supply side, when we get into transport and some of these other sectors, the US is in a different place. And that perhaps is some of the motivation behind using more of these renewable fuels in on-road vehicles, which are the major consumers of energy. Looking at US data a little bit more directly, this is shows where the ag sector is. And most of the ag sector CO2 emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions in this case, includes methane. The ag sector's equipment and machines are most represented in the transportation sector, not this slice of the ag pie. Most of this ag pie slice is from the operations of agriculture itself and land use and some other things, not so much the tractor emissions. If we dive into our sources of transportation emissions a little further in the US, you get the sense that the heavy duty trucks are a big part of that. The off-road engines and equipment are also a part, but a smaller part. Here you get a sense of that. And that's why there's been so much of a focus on electrifying the heavy duty vehicle fleet in the US, because it is the largest single source outside of passenger vehicles of CO2 emissions. And just 2 years ago, transportation surpassed electricity as the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. So all these things have come together to compel progress here in the US on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Biden administration has a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030, and then the net zero carbon by 2050 that I mentioned before. So what is the opportunity for renewable fuels? When we think about these fuels here in the US, we think about how they can reduce greenhouse gas emissions pretty quickly by a range of anywhere from 50 to 85%, depending on the feedstocks that are used to produce the fuel. And just to level set everyone with what we're talking about, I think we're all in the same understanding space on this, but the feedstocks, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, but the feedstocks principally are animal fats and vegetable oils. These are the same. The processing is different. And that's where the divergence takes place between what is traditional biodiesel on the bottom, which results in the fatty acid methyl ester, the FAME kind of fuel that we talk about, or the renewable hydrocarbon diesel that is depicted on the top line, which is a non-esterified renewable diesel product. It's a very paraffinic kind of fuel, and is what we consider to be a drop-in replacement, if you will, for conventional petroleum diesel in the US. So now, having said that, I'll give you a glimpse of what we're seeing here in the US, what the production, feedstocks, and markets are looking like, what folks are interested in. On the production side, last year, about 3 billion gallons of biodiesel or renewable diesel were produced. They had a capacity of slightly more than that. The industry's expectations are that this is going to grow to nearly 5 billion gallons by next year. And that's I think a pretty reasonable estimate. You get a sense of the feedstocks here that soybean is making up the largest portion of the biodiesel, renewable diesel feedstock at just more than half of all of it. And then the balance make up the feedstocks almost equally. And I'll share some more insight on that in a second. The markets in the US for renewables are anything that can burn diesel fuel. And we haven't, I would say, necessarily, with the exception of the states with the low carbon fuel standards, we've seen renewable diesel fuel used in all kinds of different applications, and I'll share some insights on that in just a second. And the policy drivers we've talked about a little bit. Renewable fuel standard that provides a federal tax incentive of $1 blender's tax credit per gallon of fuel produced. Obviously, this is a major support system for the market at the moment. And then there are these other policies that are emerging on carbon and state mandates. So at the moment, this is what the sector looks like here in the US. And it has grown quite substantially over time. You get the sense that we've had some pretty rapid growth in production of biofuels in the US market in recent years. So the opportunity to produce more is seems entirely consistent with where we've been coming from. The industry vision has been updated since the first slide I showed. This is the most current version of that. I just share that shows that they're looking at 6 billion gallons by 2030. And if all goes well with feedstock, we could be talking about 15 billion gallons by 2050. So to put that in perspective for everyone, here in the US, we use about 44 billion gallons of diesel last year, plus or minus a little bit. So we're looking around 3 billion gallons produced, 44 billion gallons of diesel consumed. So to focus on renewable diesel for a second, this is a slide from Neste, which is one of our member companies and is a leader a global leader in producing advanced renewable biofuels like Neste's My Renewable Diesel. And you get a sense of just from the visual here that it's a fuel that's much more, has a higher level of purity in terms of contaminants that exist. It has very high cetane level, that very favorable ignition properties for both new and existing diesel engines. And it is not biodiesel. And so just to make that clarification you saw from the previous slide, it offers some advantages over biodiesel in terms of stability and longer term storage and some other properties when burned in some kinds of diesel engines. The benefits from the renewable diesel have been established very well by Neste and some of the other producers. You understand that traditional diesel fuel cetane minimum in the US is 40, which is extremely low, we would say. Higher cetane means better ignition properties of the fuel, which means a more complete combustion, and it's actually a better driving experience as well, if you've experienced that. So the properties of renewable diesel are much amenable to an engine that runs better. It produces less byproducts of combustion. It has a very high degree of lubricity for the internal engine components, and it works quite well with the exhaust systems. And so you get a sense to see, looking at some of the injectors, and that when subjected to testing for harsh cycles, I guess as they call it, looking at blends of biodiesel versus ultra low sulfur diesel versus the Neste product. So this is just gives you an example of some of the implications of using these different levels of fuel and how renewable diesel might hold an advantage over some other biodiesel types of fuel. Talk about carbon intensity for a bit, because this is how we start to try and compare the use of renewable fuels as an option, as a viable option for diesel in the US versus electrification, excuse me, or hydrogen. And so when in a compression ignition diesel engine, you can see on the left-hand side, the diesel fuel produces a certain, just over 100 grams per CO2 per millijoule of energy. Sorry, for megajoule of energy. Spark ignition engines have a different profile in terms of CO2 production. And then we think about our electricity generation system. If we're comparing apples to apples, you get the sense that in many ways that electricity might be generated, we're not really making tremendous progress on reducing CO2 emissions if that electricity is being produced from some of the fossil fuel-based sources. So when we see this kind of comparison, it helps folks visualize the CO2 profile of different options for decarbonizing the sectors. The experience of using renewable diesel fuel in the US is very strong and growing. We've been talking about renewable diesel a lot for the last 5 years easily. And we have really some great success stories. Most of them have been driven out of California because that's where they have a low carbon fuel mandate. And that's where most of the product is today, the renewable diesel product. And this just is some anecdotal examples of how some cities are utilizing this fuel as part of their day-to-day operations, and what has it meant to them. And if you're ever in the San Francisco Bay Area and have the chance to ride the red and white ferry from different parts of the bay to another, you'll get an opportunity to experience this. But that ferry fleet switched to 100% renewable diesel overnight and saw their CO2 emissions cut by 22,000 tons a year. So it can have a pretty significant impact pretty quickly, principally because it does not require any new fueling infrastructure or vehicles to deliver these benefits. And the city of Oakland also thinks about this in the concept of a circular economy, which I think is also increasingly important. And they have a system of collecting the local raw grease from restaurants in the Oakland area through contracted vendors that pick up that supply. There's some pre-processing of it done. It gets converted into grease. And then in the next day renewable diesel process, which is very much a refining-like process, that fuel then makes its way back into the Oakland City fleet. So the very fuel that cooked your dinner 2 nights ago might be powering your Department of Public Works truck tomorrow. So this is a very interesting development and way to think about how these renewable fuels can play along. And they're using it in all kinds of different vehicles and equipment. So it's not being kept on for the lightest of tasks. They're using it in their service vehicles, their fire trucks, etc. So it's quite a good story from their perspective. I mentioned the ferry fleet already. The other place we've seen renewable diesel fuel really take hold in the U.S. in California is as an option for Pacific Gas and Electric. As part of their wildfire management strategy, they have what they call planned safety power shutoffs. When weather conditions get to a point where they're anticipating the possibility of high winds and dry conditions that might be amenable to wildfires, and I know this is of interest to you all as well, that they might shut the power off from the grid. And when they do that, they have to find a way to make sure to power certain parts of the state that they can't serve with the transmission lines. So microgrids and the use of these backup large mobile generators can provide that kind of capacity. And to make them more amenable to the public and to reduce the emissions from the use of these generators, even though they might only be used for several hours or a few days, depending on the weather patterns, they use 100% renewable diesel fuel. So we see this the fuel used in all kinds of different places. I mentioned the city of Oakland, but New York City is also sticking its toe in the water here, and it's already seen some good benefits there. They're using it in 13,000 trucks. So we see a lot of success for renewable diesel products, but it's really a California phenomenon largely. But we hope that's going to change in the near time. One of the things that's going to change that is a lot more investment by the oil refineries in renewable diesel capacity. And one of the things that we like to think about when we see comparisons of carbon reduction, we look at California. On the left here, this shows you where their CO2 reductions have come from over the last 8 or 9 years. And some people immediately think, oh, California, all those electric cars must be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's where the benefits are coming from. We just need more electric cars to reduce CO2. Not exactly the case. In fact, most of the CO2 reduction is coming from biodiesel and renewable diesel fuel, and then ethanol as well. So you get the sense that if we're interested in reducing carbon on a near-term basis, these fuels and technology have tremendous power to do that and are available as well. One of the main things that's going to boost the capacity of renewable diesel in the US is in the last few years, the conventional oil refineries producers have gotten interested and are beginning to invest in this process. We have members including Phillips 66, Renewable Energy Group, and Neste have all announced new capacity or supplies or joint ventures in recent months to produce more renewable diesel all across the US. You get a sense here that they're planned and operating or under construction kind of refineries are definitely going to bring more renewables online in a short-term period. So that will be good to boost the opportunity for using these fuels in places outside of California. let me just pause there, and I'm going to jump into a little bit more of a discussion on feedstocks to kind of wrap up here. When we think about the feedstocks, I know this is part of an interest of this group. There really are 10 or so different wastes and residues that are going into producing these fuels today. And this particular slide comes from Neste, but most of the feedstocks that are being used in the U.S. for renewable diesel are much of these same materials. And when we start looking at these from a comparative point of view, and this is a little bit of the same kind of perspective that I just shared with electricity generation, but a much more finite presentation here. You get a sense in the black in the middle how U.S. electricity is generated. And so in certain areas like the Hawaiian Islands, for example, the wells to wheels CO2 production is very high there because they have pretty much total reliance on fossil fuels for generating electricity. If you go into California, on the other end of the black bar scale, they have a very high degree of renewable energy that's part of their mix. So they're much better off on the wells to wheels CO2 production. So you get a sense that looking at different kinds of electric capacity, you can compare to the blue lines on the cluster on the left shows you the basic soy biodiesel, its wells to wheels CO2 profile compared with the California grade diesel in that same grouping. They're very close, but the carb diesel does actually have a higher CO2 emissions than a B20 or B5 biodiesel there in that case. And then similarly, if you look across to the far right, where are we getting natural gas from? Renewable natural gas or shale natural gas also has some different profiles. But as we think about different strategies for decarbonizing different sectors, all of these fuels are being considered, so it's important that we look at them all in the same way. And this next slide shows you the specific profile of renewable diesel, which looks even a whole lot better on a wells to wheels basis than any of the others that you see there today. Even better than B20 and the basic soybean produced biodiesel. So the waste residues and products have a high degree of efficiency and are converted to useful fuel in ways that some of these other potential fuels are not.
Alan, can you just go back two slide steps back to the feedstocks, the Neste feedstock one?
Yes.
That one. There you go. Thank you. Waste. Okay, cool. Missed that one. And on the soy front, are those soy products being generated from sort of marginal landscapes, or is it just a normal part of the agricultural process over there?
Yeah, normal landscapes, part of the normal agricultural process. It's not being grown on hillsides or places that can't grow anything else.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Sorry.
That's some other crops and things like I guess jatropha and other things have been investigated in some of those aspects. But the soybean production here is growing, principally in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, where we have big flat open spaces. You might be familiar with those.
Yep. Thanks.
Sure. So let me let's see here. Back onto that. So this is gives you just a sense of the combustion of these two different fuel types. And the Neste renewable diesel, you get the sense that it burns more cleanly. It is, as I said before, a drop-in replacement fuel for conventional diesel. What you're seeing on the right there is actually the California grade diesel fuel, the carb diesel. So, the properties of the fuel are really quite impressive. Looking at a little bit at this is the low carbon fuel standard. How is California getting its low carbon fuel standard feedstock fuels? Where are these coming from? And so this shows where the credits are being generated, what's coming from soy, what's coming from distillers corn oil, from tallow, and from some other sources here. Excuse me. And so you kind of get the sense that that different parts of the biomass, different crops and residues are playing different roles over time in the biomass-based residues that are part of the low carbon fuel standard in California, where the credits are coming from. I just wanted to share, I just ran across this study and I just wanted to share this because it gets into forecasting a little bit. And the Advanced Biofuels Association here in the US commissioned a study from LMC to ask a question about whether or not there's adequate feedstocks to meet the US goal to reach 21 billion gallons of biomass-based diesel to replace fossil fuels by 2040. And so this, there's the biodiesel, different organizations and associations are exploring different rules and different models for growth. So this is one from this Advanced Biofuels Association that just asked this question. And to hit that question, that means they have to have 9 billion gallons of bio-based diesel by 2030. And so they asked, whether or not it's possible based on the current feedstocks or the lipid feedstocks that are available. So LMC went out and surveyed that and found that there is substantial growth in the global oils and fats that are going to be available, and that should be quite adequate, even after taking into demand consideration for food and other things. That we should have enough lipids to be able to meet some of these higher goals for biodiesel fuel production. And the methodology for this, you can download this study and look at it yourself online. I recommend it. I'm not an expert in this particular area, but I thought it to be quite interesting in terms of predicting that there is enough feedstock, because as all these other players get into the market, the oil majors and others, so to speak, you start to wonder about, are we going to have enough feedstock? And this is the kind of research that starts to answer some of those questions. One of the things that is starting to emerge is that we have looked at these fuels as somewhat discrete blends as they've emerged on the landscape. We've had very low blends of biodiesel, 5%. Now we're seeing B20 being a much more standard kind of a fuel availability. Renewable diesel at 100% would be perhaps ideal for some because of its various performance, but it is in the smallest quantity available compared to biodiesel. So to rectify that, what about blending these two worlds together, using certain blends of biodiesel, conventional biodiesel, and more renewable diesel fuels? And so you can see that some of these different approaches can yield some pretty good results and extend the opportunity and the benefits for using biofuels. Even if you don't have access to 100% renewable, you can still blend those out with other basic biodiesel and do pretty well. One thing that we're trying to talk about a lot more in the US as we see a lot of advancements and pushes for other policies is the time value of carbon. And so that is, what's the value of removing carbon today versus waiting for a full electrified power sector that's got the ability to charge heavy duty trucks, et cetera, in 15 or 20 years from now. The use of renewable fuels can have some immediate impact, and getting more carbon out of the atmosphere now paves the way to continue to achieve some of those more bold objectives that we have for meeting the Paris Climate Accords, et cetera, in the future. So if we really care about removing carbon from the climate today, the way to do that is to use some more of these advanced low carbon renewable fuels. And as we think about the future of diesel, this is really a key part of it, the use of more of these renewable fuels. What if we have diesel engines that aren't running on diesel fuel? Going back to John's early comment, is it really, maybe it's not the engine that's the issue, maybe it's the fuel. What if we start using renewable, different kinds of fuels in the diesel engine and take advantage of that inherent energy efficiency of the technology of compression ignition and all the benefits that it brings? So it is really a cornerstone of how we're communicating about this technology in the future. But I think we have to be realistic that are a lot of pressure for other kinds of fuels and technologies. We see a lot of interest in compact electric construction equipment, for example, and that seems like a really good application. Same thing for last mile delivery vans in urban areas. Great applications for all electric, limited range, lightweight loads, come back every night. That makes a lot of sense. If we're talking about long distance, heavy power demands over extended periods of time, will any of these alternative fuels be able to meet or match what diesel can do? It remains to be seen, honestly. So we do think that the future is likely to be more eclectic than electric. And so I think that's okay. We're going to find that these fuels are going to find their way into the right sectors for them. And so just to kind of wrap up here, diesel is going to continue to play key roles in main sectors of the economy. Changes to the transportation paradigm and clean energy, it's going to take longer probably and cost more than we project. There's going to be some bumps along the way. And the users, there's still a lot of aversion to risk out there, particularly right now. So using advanced renewable fuels that take advantage of what they already have makes managing that risk perhaps a lot easier. And we think that, really the advantage of renewable biodiesel and renewable diesel fuel is you've got all the equipment that you need that can start using that fuel tomorrow. You don't have to invest in new infrastructure. You don't have to buy a new engine or vehicle or equipment type. So it's really a tremendous advantage there. So with that, I've extended my my commentary here quite substantially. So let me stop and answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Alan. We've got quite a few questions. The first is, Alan, do you gave a sense of the percentage irrigation is powered by diesel in the US, or did you go over this?
I did not, but it's definitely, I would say it's definitely declining, particularly in California, the #1 ag state. There have been substantial efforts over the last 2 decades to electrify agricultural irrigation pumps. So in California in particular, I'm pretty familiar with the fact that a good number of those have been converted to all electric. As for the rest of the country, I'm not sure about that one.
Thanks. And the next one is, what is the average cost of production for renewable diesel and biodiesel? And how does this compare to fossil diesel?
Well, now that is a really excellent question. Keep in mind that, as I mentioned today at the pump, we're seeing $5 a gallon roughly for highway grade diesel, and that includes all the federal taxes and other things in there. So, let's say $5 and change. Before the pandemic and the situation we have now with the war in Ukraine, diesel fuel in the US was running $3.20, $3 something a gallon, like that. And renewable and biodiesel fuel is actually very close to that in terms of at the pump cost. And remember that that at the pump cost is influenced by the $1 a gallon blender's tax credit that's provided through the Renewable Fuel Standard, as well as any other kinds of state or local incentives or tax breaks for producers to deliver that fuel. So it's hard to say exactly what the cost is, but I would say in recent times, with the jump in fuel prices in the US, for those that can get access to B20 or use more renewable diesel, they're going to be ahead of the game in terms of saving money over those that are just burning ultra low sulfur diesel, because biofuel costs have not gone up at the same rate as petroleum costs, because while they still have some of the transportation and other costs for the fuel and the production, they are not subject to some of these wild swings we're seeing in crude oil. And that's really the #1 driver of the diesel fuel price around the world, honestly, and that's the crude oil price. And we're pegged at over $100 a barrel at the moment. And I think we're predicting in the US that's going to moderate a little bit next year, but not a tremendous amount.
Great, thanks. And the next one is, how do we fast track domestic renewable diesel production?
Okay, great question. So I think, what we learned in the US here was that, biodiesel started as a, as a business in the farm community in the Midwest, right? The folks that were growing soybeans decided, by golly, we can use some of the things that we're investing in to grow as crops and we're going to sell. We can use some of that same stuff for fuel. So if we can use it, why can't others? So the industry was born, I think, out of proximity and closeness to the source of the fuel and the feedstock, in this case, primarily soybeans. So it created an industry, a conversation bubble around the use of biodiesel and the production of biodiesel. And one major farmer started to see that, hey, we can do this. It's not that complicated. Next thing you know, there's one a few miles away that's trying the same kind of thing. So I think we've learned a lot here that this in large ways, building the infrastructure and things around where the feedstock is can have huge payoffs because it creates a natural demand. It creates the natural market is there for the use of the fuel. And, that is the best circumstance for initial results. Getting to scale is another matter altogether. When we start talking about the volumes that are envisioned here, I mean, you're talking much more commercial grade refining, distribution, and all of that. So, if you, I don't want to say if you can keep it local, but starting it local, that's going to be your blast off point.
Great, thanks. How can you label diesel near zero emissions when you consider all of its upstream impacts to get to the pump?
When we talk about near zero emissions for diesel, we are talking about near zero tailpipe emissions for particulate matter and nitrogen oxide emissions. And so that is if you know anything at all about diesel, the 98% reduction in emissions from a diesel engine of using petroleum-based diesel is quite an accomplishment. And yes, there are upstream issues with the production of the fuel, and nobody's discounting that. But in terms of what comes out the tailpipe and what gets counted in our air quality inventories and how we set air quality policy in the US, today's diesel is so much more lower in emissions than previous generations that we can see market improvement in things like acid rain. We took sulfur out of diesel fuel. We don't have really an acid rain problem in the US anymore. We're seeing dramatic reductions in nitrogen oxide and particulate emissions in ways that we never thought we could. That's not going to be enough, though, for the future, as EPA, as I said, takes us another step forward. So I don't think industry has any problem at all saying we have a technology that today is near zero emissions.
Thanks. And how does current generation renewable diesel compare to petroleum diesel for emission levels with the latest diesel engines?
It's very good. It's comparable in terms of all the emissions. It's better on CO2, obviously, because of the benefits from the feedstock, and as I mentioned, anywhere from 50 to 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to petroleum diesel. You also find that some of the NOx and PM emissions are better. Engine out emissions from using renewable diesel fuel, again, because of the ignition properties of the fuel and how it is combusted. One thing that we don't have in the US at the moment is the diesel engines that we have are optimized to run on diesel fuel that meets the current specification, the D975 ASTM diesel fuel spec. And so while that contemplates uses of small quantities of biofuels, that means that the engines are not fully optimized to take advantage of all the emission reduction benefits that we might see from, if we started from scratch and said, let's make an engine that would burn on just renewable diesel and optimize it just for that. We could be making even more progress on reducing emissions overall. But we're just not in that situation. I don't know that we ever would be. But in terms of comparison to current day emissions, generally better, much better, of course, on CO2.
And biodiesel in the past has been associated with engine failure. What has changed?
The quality of the fuel in the US has changed dramatically since I've been involved in the diesel forum since its inception over 20 years ago. And I would say that, we've seen the industry really move towards a high quality BQ 9000 standard and subsequent standards on the purity, performance, the stability of their products. That's given people a lot more confidence with using these fuels and wanting to sell those fuels on a retail basis. I think we've had, like any new technologies, sure, there have been issues of fuel injector plugging, deposits, and other things that have come about. I showed some of that perhaps in some of those images. But, I would say by and large, those kind of situations with proper fuel management in a fleet, largely we don't see those anymore. You have high quality processing, quality control situation in place. The problems that we saw 10 or 15 years ago, really, we're not seeing at all these days. So it's hats off to the biodiesel producers, and that's really a self-policed and self-created trend that they've done there on higher quality fuels. And that's hard to do when you have many different producers all doing things their own way. When you start mixing all that together, one day your local retailer, convenience store, service station has biodiesel from one vendor. The next day it might have it from another, and then you get, did you get a bad batch? Did the fuel have water in it? Did it cause problems with engine performance? Those kinds of issues, we've all been down that road before, but with the right kind of fuel hygiene and management program, those are very much manageable.
Thanks. And if the USA can produce only 15 billion gallons of RD by 2050, how will the other 30 billion gallons of the current diesel market be satisfied? How much of the diesel market will be electrified or displaced in other ways?
It's a really good question. I think, as I said, we think the future is going to be eclectic. So there's going to be, the pie for what's to the current day diesel demand is going to change. We're definitely going to still have the majority of heavy duty commercial trucks, which are the largest fuel consumer in the US, are still going to be diesel in the 2040 timeframe. Even California, which has mandated that manufacturers sell zero emission vehicles starting in just a few years, even they contemplate that by 2040, fully 60% of California trucks could still be running on diesel. So the demand for diesel is still going to be there quite dramatically. I think what we're going to see is that it's going to be more focused in some segments than others. So we're going to lose some diesel users in the light and medium duty trucks. Initially, that's where a lot of the proof of concept on electrification is taking place. Hydrogen presents some interesting opportunities, both as being burned as an internal combustion engines, as well as being part of a fuel cell technology. So you could see for long haul trucks, some divergence there, some electrified power coming in to replace diesel, some hydrogen perhaps as well. But we're definitely going to see diesel still make a big piece of that pie. And hopefully the renewable fuel part comes along and grows. I think it's going to grow faster, at least initially, than electrification or hydrogen, simply because the challenges to bring those new fuels and infrastructures to the market at scale are quite formidable and require a whole lot of things to fall in place in a fairly short amount of time.
Thank you. How are producers in the US balancing the need for producing food affordability and sustainably as opposed to producing crops for fuel?
Yeah, it's always, the mantra is always food first, then fuel. And that's really served the industry pretty well. I think that, folks are looking at new sources of feedstocks, cover crops and some other things that were not initially looked at for ease of processing in the early days might be coming more into focus in the future. So we'll see how that emerges, but we definitely don't see that, that we're planting acres of soybeans to create diesel fuel to power trucks. Not happening.
And is there any commercial renewable diesel, not biodiesel, that has strictly zero emissions or better on full life cycle analysis?
I definitely think that there is some of that. I honestly, at the moment, I don't want to say I'm brain dead, but I can't recall exactly some of the latest data and studies. There have been a few reports come out recently from the National Renewable Energy Lab and others that have looked at some of these wells to wheels questions much more specifically. I'd be happy to follow up on that question and any others with John and to share with the audience that I don't get to here.
And the last question is, do you have any comment on algal biofuel?
I know that the oil majors have been invested in looking at algal biofuel and getting, growing biodiesel from algae basically for some time. I don't know that it's reached the kind of scale or critical mass of interest that some of the other fuels and feedstocks have in the same time frame. I think it's still a work in progress, but I think it's maybe lower down the scale than we thought.
Great, thanks. That's all the questions I have for you.
Very
Brilliant.
good.
Okay, well, thanks, Al. Thanks for the time. And I realise that you've got about a minute before you need to race off to the next important episode of your life. So thanks for making the time in your evening after a hectic day at an EPA sort of meet up to make time to discuss the stuff you have. I'm very glad it's recorded because I realised that about halfway through I was sort of like I'd reached the brain full and overflowing point. So I'm going to have to go back and have another look through this again because it's just chock-a-block full of very interesting and sort of informative stuff. So thank you heaps for that. It has been a pleasure to sort of hear what's going on the other side of the world and realise that, you know, the thoughts that we've sort of been playing around with seem to be really quite relevant, and the developments and the possibilities seem to be very real. And the idea of renewable diesel as a quick way to reduce carbon is like, yeah, it's sort of like a no-brainer in many ways, but we've got to get access to that fuel, and that really is the question that I'm sort of throwing to Mel the next speaker is like, how do we make this stuff available in Australia? Obviously, the stuff that is made is under some pressure to be, from this day, it'd be under pressure to go to sort of some markets beyond Australia's, I should think. So the idea of building up some capacity in our own right to self-produce seems an incredibly sensible thing. Maybe we'd be able to sell some to America, Alan, do you think? So
There you go.
in time to come.
I mean, you've got a great set of experts and really thoughtful companies there. I have no doubt that you'll be successful. But let's keep talking and keep sharing. And I'm happy to respond to further questions or offline at some point in the future. So thank you again for the opportunity. Maybe I'll hang on here for a little while.
Yep. Okay. Thanks very much, Al. Okay, we'll move on to the next speaker is Mel Campbell from various sort of areas. I think Mel sort of is representing, but the one I'm really interested in is Renuleum. Mel, can you pop into the world and we'll have a bit of a chat? So Renuleum I saw a presentation at a bioenergy conference online last year, and I thought that looks like one of the most interesting things in the world because of the renewable diesel potential. And I think you're just going to run through some of that today. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, John, we're just going to go through that and just what we're doing in the renewable diesel space. Thanks very much for putting me behind Alan. You've gave me a challenge in terms of setting a high benchmark for speakers. So yeah, I'd really like to. You've done a great job bringing Alan on board. So I'll try and do half as good as he does, and I've done a really good job in my presentation.
Brilliant stuff. So you've got a couple of hats on in your life. Renuleum's one, and you work with what's the name of that consulting company that?
Frontier Impact Group. It's all connected, and I'll probably can be a little bit confusing in the presentation. I'll explain a little bit more, but yeah, Frontier Impact Group has got a subsidiary called Renuleum. We're developing renewable diesel, and we've also got a partnership with a ASX listed gas and oil company, a small company who's looking to pivot from oil and gas. That's Carnarvon Energy, and we've formed a joint venture called Future Energy Australia, and so Renuleum's doing a joint venture with them, primarily in Western Australia at the moment. That may be expanded, but we're doing projects right across Australia.
Brilliant. All right, well, let's get into it, Mel, and hear what the future might look like.
Yeah, so just in terms of framing, John, how long have I got?
Oh, look, we could get sort of in a 20 minutes, half hour sort of zone.
Yep, that's fine. I'll target that then. No problems at all. I'll just share my screen and see if that'll work.
That's all. Whereabouts are you located today, Mel?
I'm actually in Perth, so I'm actually travelling over in Perth, but I'm based in Port Macquarie in New South Wales normally, but yeah, right across the other side of the country at this point in time. All right. Just working on our first project, so that's the reason. Yeah. Natasha, can you help me with sharing my screen, please?
I can. Oh no, I've lost you. Here we go.
I'm across the other side of the country.
All right,
Yep.
try now.
Looks good.
It looks like it's coming on. So
Awesome.
Okay. We'll start from the beginning then.
good on you. Right, away we go, Mel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity, John, to talk. And yeah, I really like to thank Alan for his presentation and sort of given me a lot of food to thought. And fortunately, he's answered some of the questions. And for me, that some of the challenges we've got, but we've got some equally the same challenges in Australia, and probably a little bit more, to be honest, in terms of getting things happening. And the US has made great strides in that area. So I'm just going to talk to you about renewable diesel and what Future Energy Australia and Frontier Impact Group are doing in Australia, looking towards supporting fuel security and net zero carbon for fuels. So Future Energy Australia, as I mentioned before, is a joint venture between Frontier Impact Group and Carnarvon Energy. Frontier Impact Group is our climate solutions advisory firm. We're looking at a whole lot of sustainable approaches to agriculture, energy, air emissions, and also water. Carnarvon's a listed ASX company, which has got the Dorado oil field in Western Australia, a number of other oil exploration points it's looking at and looking to develop, but it's looking to pivot and transition. It's got a net carbon zero target, and this first step is actually this joint venture with us in energy transition technology in Western Australia. Before I start, I'll just talk about what is renewable diesel, and unfortunately, Alan sort of covered a fair bit of this. And I think the first point is it's not biodiesel, and Alan reinforced that in his presentation. It's a diesel produced from renewable biomass-based feedstock, so biogenic feedstock, and it's got properties consistent with petroleum oil-derived diesel fuel. It's not entirely consistent, but very, very close. And unlike biodiesel, which has some other properties that are inconsistent, it can be used as a direct replacement for diesel with no equipment modifications. Physically, it can. There's some other challenges around that, which I'll talk to you a little bit later. The technology we're using to produce renewable diesel produces a diesel that has been certified to US and European diesel standards and tested to New Zealand diesel standards and Australian fuel standard for automotive diesel. And it's also been tested to the Caterpillar specification. And there's one area where I'll talk to you a little bit later, which relates to density, which also relates to cetone rating, which Alan mentioned before with Neste. That, for example, Neste fuel, the same as ours, would not meet any of the Australian fuel standard for automotive diesel on density. So there's a few things that challenges in Australia that we need to look at in terms of making it more prevalent. But there's still some number of options because that Australian fuel standard for automotive diesel only relates to on-road use of diesel. I'll talk about the testing a little bit later in more detail. So our current project, our first project, we're looking at a renewable diesel project that produces 18 million litres of renewable diesel per annum, but we can scale up if there's sufficient long-term biomass feedstock. And that's been one of the big issues with all bioenergy projects where biodiesel, renewable diesel, be it bioenergy, bioelectricity type projects, is that long-term supply of biomass. And a lot of those bioenergy projects in the past have relied on having biomass that is zero cost or waste that they can actually take away. So or get paid to take away that biomass and use it as a waste. And over time, that waste becomes a resource, and then that resource then makes the economics unsustainable. So our technology and our approach, we're actually paying for the biomass, and we're paying prices that make it long-term sustainable to produce supply that biomass to our projects. So that's one of the differences, I guess, and why we're very conscious of in trying to make sure we get long-term sustainable biomass supplies. The other thing is, once we roll out a number of these projects, it'll start assisting in Australia's long-term fuel security, because as everyone knows, Australia's refinery capacity has reduced significantly. And even if the refinery capacity, we're still even if we did have the refinery capacity, we're still importing a lot of our oil regardless. So John mentioned Renuleum. So we've actually created in the sense that to avoid confusion, I guess, on biodiesel and new renewable diesel not being biodiesel, we're looking at a situation where we've created a new fuel brand we call Renuleum. And we've also called our subsidiary of FIG that's involved in the production of the renewable diesel, Renuleum. And so that's basically producing a fuel that's got a higher cetone result with cleaner burning fuel and greater engine performance. And Alan's done a great job for me in with referring to Neste. We have similar results and similar performance to Neste, albeit that our feedstock is not an oil-based feedstock. It's actually a lignocellulosic feedstock, so woody biomass, crop residues, that type of stuff. It's also got a very low sulfur and aromatic content, and can also be blended with petroleum diesels or other biofuels to create a drop-in one that actually meets the Australian standards. So there's a number of avenues for the renewable diesel under the current legislation, but we'd certainly prefer it to be a much cleaner path to have renewable diesel to be able to stand in its own right. Future Energy's vision and project pipeline. We've got over 20 projects identified across Australia. That's about $2 billion in capital investment. You can see some dots on the map there. Our initial facility is likely to be at Narrogin. Well, it will be at Narrogin in Western Australia in the wheat belt. And that's going to be using waste biomass from plantation timber, from stumps, and from other residues from other plantation biomass projects. So we've got that project's, I've got the details on the timeline, but that project's due to come online in late Q4 next year and be finally commissioned in early 2024. That's the first of 20. We've got opportunity for further projects over and above that 20. That's 20 we've firmly identified. There's a number of other dots I could have put across the map there of other places we're looking at. So it's quite a significant pipeline, and 20 projects, to give you an idea, is 360 million litres of renewable diesel per annum. A typical project, and if you look at our Narrogin project, a capital cost is about 110 million. The technology is modular, and we've targeted at least 4 modules to get some economies of scale. But if we've got more feedstock, we can actually produce, get further economies of scale and produce 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12 modules on a plant. So it's fully modular, so we can actually increase the scale quite readily. The technology itself is new, but it has a performance guarantee available from an international insurance. So we've actually made sure that we've got support from a financial perspective that if the technology doesn't perform, we've got insurance to make sure that we've got a 10-year coverage, that the technology will perform for 10 years, and that's covered by insurance policies that will guarantee the performance of that technology. Employment, each of the projects is 35 to 40 full-time employees, depending on how we deploy it. There's at least 90 indirect jobs that arise out of each of those. And all the projects are going to be in regional Australia. And I think that, 35 to 40 might not seem a lot, and then you add the 90 on, there's over 120, and then it's in regional Australia. And there's other flow-on jobs from some of the other aspects that we'll talk about a little bit later. So we're producing 80 million litres of renewable diesel, and that's our focus. But as a bonus on the side, we get 8,300 tonnes of high-quality biochar, and it's about 6.5 million litres of wood vinegar. And I'll explain the advantages and the benefits of that to the rural sector primarily, and so some other opportunities in the biochar sector as well. To produce that, we need about 55,000 bone-dry equivalent tonnes of biomass per annum. And that's not an insignificant amount of biomass, but we've effectively secured that for our Narrogin project and a number of other projects well in train with discussions on long-term supplies of biomass. And that is the biggest challenge is the feedstock. I think everyone recognises that. And I think that's something that we're very, very cognizant of. The technology is commercially proven at commercial scale. It's a high temperature pyrolysis, and I'll explain a little bit about how it works in the next slide or two. The project benefits, basically, we're getting economic and environmental outcomes for feedstocks such as oil mallees and agricultural residues in Narrogin. So a longer term, there's a lot of oil mallee plantations in Narrogin that, or around the wheat belt in Western Australia, that have just sat there a bit basically on the promise that the oil mallee would develop a market and be able to sell the oil mallee products, and they've sat there and have been unexploited. So we're basically going to make sure that we actually materialise on some of the promises that were made years ago on oil mallee and provide a market for the sale of oil mallee and harvesting of the oil mallees and using that as an energy crop. There's also an opportunity to use agricultural residues in terms of pellets from wheat straw and oat straw and canola. And so there's an opportunity to do that as well. The project delivers zero emissions, and I said in response to one of Kelly's questions, I'll talk to you about the life cycle analysis and how we say it's zero emissions. It's not zero emissions at the tailpipe. There's still, when you burn something comes out the tailpipe, but it's net zero emissions when I go through the life cycle. Increases domestic fuel security. There's CO2 emissions reductions, especially when you're looking at biomass that's currently being burnt. If you really want to look at the perspective, you find some crop residues across Australia are actually being burnt. So if we actually take that crop residue and use that in our plant, we've got the opportunity to actually make it even more carbon negative. But that just makes it more carbon negative. It improves it. It's already zero emission or net carbon negative even before we can take that into consideration. We're looking to locate close to biomass sources because, as people would know, with biomass projects or bioenergy projects, the big challenge is trying to reduce your costs in transporting a fairly low density material to site. So the idea is to locate the plants central to biomass sources. And one of the advantages of our technology is, even though it's modular, we're using 4 modules, it's still much smaller scale than other technologies which use things like Fischer-Tropsch type technology, which need probably 4 to 5 times the or even higher volumes than we need for a biomass. So that's one of the advantages. We can make them put the plants close to the biomass sources, which one reduces the cost, and it also reduces the emissions in transporting the biomass from the biomass sources to the plant. Supports building a circular economy, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Supports regional jobs creation. The byproducts, wood vinegar and biochar, and the processing of those creates new business and job opportunities as well. And we've also got a pathway to hydrogen in the future, and I'll talk about that in a separate slide. Just looking at our value proposition, one of the challenges we're having, and we sort of struggle with, is exporting Australian resources and having them value added overseas. And I think one of the classics is, if I just look at this table and you look at the renewable fuel pyrolysis option that we're providing and compare that to wood chip export. So we've got 55,000 dry ton equivalents of biomass. It's wood chip form. We don't need it in wood chip form. We'll eventually we can have it in a number of different forms, but we'll chip it ourselves, but not to the standard required for overseas export. It'll actually reduce carbon emissions by more than 70,000 tonnes per annum. That's our particular process. Wood chip export does nothing for Australia. It may, if it's burnt in material in power stations overseas, it may reduce emissions overseas, but it does nothing in terms of reducing Australia's emissions content. If you're avoiding burning biomass, this isn't related to wood chip, but more to crop residues, you're potentially saving about 100,000 tonnes per annum of carbon emissions. The big important thing that I want to highlight is the value add from our process is, for each of those 50 tonnes of bone dry equivalent biomass, we're adding $900 per tonne in value and producing $45 million in economic revenue, whereas that same 55,000 tonnes, if it was exported, would produce about $11 million in revenue. So obviously we think it's crazy to have wood chip exported, and some of that used some of it may be pelletized before it goes, but some of it may be used in either paper pulping or in biomass power stations overseas. And we could get an extra $34 million economic value by having that biomass utilised in Australia. Number of jobs, a lot more jobs in Australia. The indirect jobs, total number of jobs, and we've got some ability to create other products, value-add products off the back of that in the form of graphene, which I'll mention just briefly at the end. It's net carbon negative, so we've actually done a comparison, and the net carbon negative is done on a life cycle assessment that was previously done. This is based on a study done in Canada on the technology by an independent consultant, using Canadian greenhouse gas inventory. We translated some of those results into the Australian context, and it reduces the carbon intensity by a massive amount, to the extent that it is carbon negative. So basically, how can you be carbon negative? Basically, we take what it takes to produce well-to-wheel for a petroleum diesel, and then compare what our emissions are compared to the emissions from that process. So if you like, it's tree to wheel versus well to wheel, and it's significant. The other important thing is in terms of emissions bang for your buck in terms of land area. If in the West Australian context, the emissions we're reducing is equivalent to a high efficiency 110 megawatt solar farm, but we only occupy 2% of the land area of a solar farm. So that gives you an equivalent aspect. We've got a independent study currently being done on a full life cycle analysis, which will actually do it fully in the Australian context. We've just our own study is just internal study has translated the Canadian study into the Australian context. So we'll be able to prove that we are a fully carbon negative project. To get carbon negative, it also relies on the fact that we're using renewable electricity for the electricity consumption on the plant, and also that we're producing biochar, and that biochar is going to be used in a situation where it's going to be sequestered, either as by going back into the soil as a soil amelioration, or being used as a product in, for example, graphene in the production of cement, which in turn reduces cement usage. I'll come back to that and talk about that a little bit more. The technology itself, I'll just talk to it really quickly. The biomass comes in, say in the form of pellets or wood chip. We basically then run them through a pyrolysis project. Pyrolysis is effectively a process where you thermally heat a material up, but there's no oxygen there, so it doesn't combust per se. So instead of when you burn wood in a combustion process, for example, the carbon combines with oxygen, produces carbon dioxide, and also produces ash. So in our process, there's no oxygen, and effectively the carbon comes out as carbon. It doesn't form carbon dioxide, so most of it comes out as a biochar. So 15% of the biomass going in comes out as a 90% plus carbon product. In the pyrolysis process, it also produces a gas, and that gas, a synthesis gas, or syngas as it's commonly called, has got two components. Those two components are a condensable, and you can convert it to liquid, and a non-condensable, which you can't convert to a liquid. So the condensable stream contains two things: diesel molecules and a water-based product. So you've got a water-based product, and you've also got renewable diesel. And that's one of the big things about this technology. You don't need a catalyst like Fischer-Tropsch does to produce diesel. It actually, the temperature at which it operates, which is 1100 degrees C, it has enough energy in it to produce diesel molecules in its own right. So to produce the diesel coming out the other end, effectively you condense out the condensable liquids, you scrape the, that's not the technical term, but I'll describe it a little more agriculturally, that you scrape the diesel off the top, and because it's lower density than water, and you then run that through a filter, and out comes renewable diesel. On the other side of things, the other condensable components would comprise water products, which we distill out wood vinegar. About 70% of that product is wood vinegar, and the other 30% is water, which we then purify, put through a filter, and produce to irrigation grade water. We can pivot and actually, if in the long term, if renewable diesel, and I can't foresee it happening, but people often ask the question, what's the long-term market for renewable diesel? It's only, hydrogen, electric. But I think Alan sort of made a point, and I think a number of people made a point about the investment required to replace equipment. And not all equipment is suitable for hydrogen and electricity anyway. For example, you're not going to be able to run aircraft on long-term, long-haul aircraft on hydrogen or on electricity, probably not in the near term, not in the medium term, and maybe not even in the longer term. And so we can upgrade our renewable diesel to a sustainable aviation fuel. The other thing we can do is obviously convert to hydrogen. And if the market gives us that situation, we've got an incremental capital cost to either refine it further to produce SAF, or refine it at this level to produce hydrogen. I'll just skip that slide for the moment in the interest of time. The sustainable feedstocks, we can use a whole range. We can actually even use MSW in the technology, but we've avoided that at the moment because we're trying to make it a very clean environmental process project, and also support the regional sectors across Australia. Longer term, we'll be using the technology for MSW to diesel applications, but our primary focus is on forestry residue, branches, and stumps. We're not trying to cut down trees. We're trying to avoid, make sure we've got a strong social license to operate and avoid issues and alarmist type press, which I've seen past people talk, koala killing and things like that in terms of using biomass for this type of process. So that's quite extreme reactions, but we're certainly making sure we're very sustainable and we're using residues, or we're actually growing purpose-built energy crops or taking advantage of purpose-built energy crops, or we're taking advantage of agricultural residue. So that's our focus, to make sure it's sustainable and long-term viable, both from an economic and from an environmental perspective. A number of other energy crops that can be used. I've spoken about oil mallee. I mentioned that briefly, and that's good in a low rainfall area, and also to improve the lower the water table, and by using oil mallee. There's a number of other energy crops that can be used depending on the region that they are. And some of these can be used as transitional crops as part of a rotational crop process, and will provide a long-term viable income stream for those energy crop producers, or we'll produce our own energy crops ourselves. And once again, once you start talking about energy crops, you get in the argument of fuel versus food, and we're very conscious of that. So in any time we're using energy crops for fuel as opposed to potential food, we're looking at using the energy crops on marginal land that isn't suitable for food production. Benefits for farmers, and once again, these are regional projects, and certainly in Narrogin, we're doing a lot of work with the local farming community. We've started doing a lot of work in that area, and we will be with our other regional projects as we roll them out across Australia. First of all, it provides a market for crop residues. Not all crop residues are suitable, just because the technology, if they've got a high ash content, it doesn't produce as high quality biochar. But we can still use it, but it's just not optimal from our perspective. Provides the farmers to earn additional income through energy cropping if they've got marginal land. It also, and we've got a number of models around that. We're happy to lease the land and grow our own energy crops. We're happy for the farmers to produce energy crops, and we'll harvest them and use the crops and pay a price, or we will provide for make a payment for them to deliver the energy crops to the door, and we'll make a payment, give them a long-term payment stream for that energy cropping. We're also producing the biochar, so we've got the ability to provide back the biochar to improve soil carbon levels and nutrient retention and water retention in the soils, and also wood vinegar, and I'll talk about those a little bit later quite quickly. Enables farmers to rehabilitate degraded farmlands by planting energy crops. For example, oil mallee will actually improve salinity and improve in local hydration. And we can also, part of our offering is to enable farmers to support them in delivering soil carbon and plantation carbon projects, so they can actually get carbon benefits out of their projects as well. So we're sort of looking at a very circular economy, a very holistic solution for regional Australia. Just talking about biochar, just briefly. Biochar is the carbon that's produced out the back end of as a byproduct of the process. It's almost not a byproduct because it's nearly as valuable as the renewable diesel. We produce about over 800,000 tonnes of graphene-rich biochar, and I'll talk about graphene really quickly in a moment. But the applications for biochar are carbon soil sequestration. You basically put the carbon into the soil, so it's actually you're sequestering the carbon. It enhances the soil. Our biochar is nearly, it's not quite, but it's close to activated carbon sort of levels. There's about, surface area is about 250 square meters per gram. And so it's got a lot of little holes and little pockets in it, which is great for water retention, and also great for microbes for promoting soil, organic soil matter. It can be used for water filtration. It can be used for metallurgical charcoal, and also for animal feed. And there's been a lot of research done that shows that biochar actually reduces methane, and so there's certainly a significant market for it in that sector as well, longer term. Graphene, our biochar has got significant graphene-like properties and can actually be upgraded to about a 90% in one process and up to 99% in other processes. For people who are familiar with graphene, graphene is currently produced from predominantly from mining graphite and then upgrading to graphene through various chemical and electric and exfoliation type processes. And it's very expensive, and we can actually produce a graphene from our biochar that is equivalent to the highest grade, close to the highest grade graphene, and it's renewable. We've basically produced a renewable graphene that doesn't involve mining, doesn't involve chemical exfoliation, and has the properties equivalent to that biochar for a fraction of the cost of that biochar, so of that graphene. So we're basically moving very strongly into that area. I'm not going to go into graphene too much given the time constraints, but one of the things that is one of the issues, and we talk about electrification and its replacement of renewable diesel, is the batteries and how much there is a need to actually implement batteries and produce a number of batteries to replace renewable diesel, replace diesel, sorry. And by having the graphene batteries, we actually help the electrification side of things as well. So our project not only produces renewable diesel that displaces diesel, it also helps in producing batteries that will help displace diesel in the longer term as well. So the graphene batteries have all the properties you can see on there. It's a higher energy density. To give you an idea, and one of the most exciting things, which I haven't got on the slide here, is that graphene actually has a larger layer between each atomic layer, a larger gap between each atomic layer. And so it can actually fit sodium ions in to spaces, and where a traditional electrode requires lithium ions, lithium atoms to go between the spaces. The larger space between the graphene layers allows sodium ions potentially to be a replacement for lithium, and sodium is the 4th or 5th most common element in the world. So if we can develop a sodium graphene battery, it will actually become a much more sustainable and a much more readily able to be manufactured and scale up battery technology. So we see that as a long-term advantage of graphene. Wood vinegar is another valuable byproduct. Wood vinegar, also called pyroligneous acid. People ask me what it is, and I guess the easiest way I describe it, and it was described to me once, was to say it's when you have a bushfire come through and you get the seeds to germinate, people say, oh, well, you need the fire for the seeds to germinate, and that causes the native seeds to germinate. It isn't the fire that causes it, it's the actual smoke that causes the seeds to germinate. And so I refer to wood vinegar as liquid smoke. And that liquid smoke has many uses. It's used in it's not used as a fertilizer. It's a fertilizer enhancement. What it does is increase the uptake of fertilizer. And so it actually reduces the amount of fertilizer you use. We're doing a presentation to a group the other day, and one of the guys was a fertilizer representative, and he said he jokingly said he wasn't very interested. It's going to mean I'm going to be selling less fertilizer if we use wood vinegar. So wood vinegar, especially in the initial stages, especially if you're using fertigation, if you put wood vinegar in there, you'll actually reduce the amount of fertilizer you actually need to use. It's also a soil disease inhibitor, an insect repellent, a fungicide, and has been used historically as a health product for humans and animals in a very diluted form. So we produce a lot of wood vinegar as part of our process, and there's a significant opportunity to use that, feed that back into the agricultural sector to help with reducing fertilizer and promoting crop growth. Our challenges at the moment are there, and these are just some of the challenges, and not in our project development, but around renewable diesel, is there's no renewable diesel standard in Australia. There's no actual definition of what renewable diesel is. We'll be the first producers of scale of renewable diesel. So we're obviously taking a fair bit of time and action trying to actually create a renewable diesel standard. So we're sort of starting to try and drive that. And we've had support from a number of sectors in trying to develop that. I think there's a recognition there. And it's not just for us, companies like Neste, et cetera, they can't meet the Australian diesel standard, and they're not recognised as renewable diesel. So that's number one off the things that we're working on at the moment. There's no financial incentives for renewable diesel. It's not even get excise relief in the same way that biodiesel does. So there's no financial incentives. We'd love an incentive like the US has got in terms of producer tax to produce renewable diesel. That will make a huge difference both for the economics of our project and also the price at which we can sell it to the public. The other challenges are the current on-road diesel standard. That's the Australian automotive fuel standard for automotive diesel. It doesn't recognise lower density fuels as being eligible. It meets when I said we did testing, our renewable diesel meets all the requirements of the Australian standard except density, and it would actually meet the US standard, the ASTM 975, I think it is. I could have the wrong number there, but anyway, it meets the US standard because it doesn't have a density requirement on it. And that's despite the fact the lower density actually equates to a higher cetane rating and better burning, as Alan's presentation demonstrated. So that on-road diesel standard, we're trying to work on that. I think that's going to be a fair bit of work and a long time to get that. In the meantime, we're working around the current process of having to get an exemption under the standard Section 13 exemption to allow us to sell the diesel on road. Doesn't stop us from selling off road. We have tested it to the Caterpillar standard and the Caterpillar specification, and it's interesting. The Caterpillar specification says it's got a density in it, but it says if the fuel meets all the other specification requirements other than density, then it's acceptable for use in Caterpillar engines. So that they recognise the fact that density is not should not be an inhibitor to actually using renewable diesel. The other challenge is long-term environmentally sustainable biomass supply. That's a problem I've already identified earlier with all bioenergy projects. Problem of scale versus biomass transport distances. We think we've solved that by this modular technology, rather than having to transport biomass long distances. We're targeting less than 100-kilometre transport distances, so we'll be centralising our plants in where we've got a biomass resource sufficient to meet the plant requirements, the minimum plant requirements within 100 kilometres. Food versus fuel argument. We're obviously using marginal land or targeting marginal land for any energy crops that we're looking at, and that has the benefits. Most of the energy crops not only use marginal land, but they also improve the marginal land, so it can actually be transformed later. And one of the other challenges a little bit we've experienced is different EPA approaches in different states. And also, they don't really recognise biomass to diesel as a technology. Sometimes we get lumped in with that MSW incineration plants in terms of the way the EPA treats them. So we've got to go through EPA approvals, treating us like we're converting MSW or some other less homogeneous material than what we're using. And renewable material like we're using and converting that to diesel, we're being treated in the same because it's new and some of it doesn't fit the boxes. So we're doing some work with the EPA, and we're getting positive results from positive encouragement from a lot of the EPA authorities across a number of states. So I'm not sort of complaining about, but it's just a challenge we've got to overcome and work through. So our current project, we're looking for start our first production of the first unit in late 2023. We're expecting FID later this year. We're going through the EPA approval process, and we expect that we'll have full commissioning in early 2024. And yeah, that was about it for my presentation today.
Great stuff, Mel. Yeah, sort of one of the questions still remains is sort of like, getting it live in the country, isn't it, really? It's sort of, they've been able to get a litre of renewable diesel would be a lovely thing.
Being first is not very easy, John. That's all I can say.
Yeah, but hopefully we'll get there. I think there'll be a range of questions, and we'll probably just have to cull through a few of those for the sake of time. But if you just shoot through a few tests, we've just got a couple of minutes.
Sure. Could you get more specific about the makeup of the 55,000 TPA and cost per delivered tonne to plant and proportion of the cost litre this impacts the product? Does that make sense?
Yep, it does. Yes.
Good.
So the 55,000 tonnes, that's a bone dry equivalent. So at 45% moisture, that's at 45% moisture, that's about 100,000 tonnes per annum. In our first project, the makeup's going to be primarily wood chips and from blue gum and pine and pine stumps. And also we'll be looking at some crop residues as part of that process. In terms of the cost, we've got a delivered cost. I think it's a little bit commercially sensitive at this point in time because there's a number of people aggregating biomass across Australia. So I'd rather not comment too much on that, but we know that we can pay a price that makes it economic to provide both a stumpage cost for the wood, in example, and also to provide for the processing and transport to site. So we know we've done across multiple states, and we've done some benchmarking, and we know basically what it costs to do that. So we know that that contributes significantly. And in terms of the impact, the variation, a 5% increase in biomass is effectively probably about a 3% increase in price of fuel. So that gives you a bit of an idea of sort of ratio of sensitivities of biomass cost to fuel cost. So it is significant.
Thanks. Can the syngas be utilised in spark ignition engines without further processing?
Yeah, can. We slightly in the technology can, and it is actually being used in the US in that process. It's slightly different. You put a slightly wetter feedstock in and change the process a little bit, but then they can put them into. So they're using them in Caterpillar engines at the moment in that process over in the US. But we looked at that, and from an overall economic value added, renewable diesel is an order of magnitude more valuable than it is producing electricity, but certainly technically no problems at all, and has been done and is being done.
Is your pyrolysis process continuous or batching?
Continuous. It's a continuous process. Basically got a conveyor feeding the wood chip into a hopper, and the hopper basically feeds it through the pyrolysis. The pyrolysis is what you'd call a fast pyrolysis. It's sort of between fast and slow, I guess. It's about a 2-minute residence time in the pyrolysis chamber for those who understand the technical sides of it. But it's about a 2-minute residence time in the pyrolysis chamber.
Great.
You might, Nelly, you might get room for one more, but
sure.
Otherwise we are getting pretty close to the sort of end game, and I do want to make sure we get James Jackson to have a bit of a spiel. James just recovering from COVID, so we might just. I think if there's any questions that are really burning, Mel, are you comfortable with people emailing you? Or
yeah, they can do that, or I can answer in the chat if you like. I can answer back in the chat.
Yeah,
if you like.
Yeah. If you don't mind doing that, that'd be good.
Yeah, no problems. Too easy.
Thanks. All right, so we'll jump over and talk to James, who's been our resident sort of wise man of the tribe from an agricultural perspective of all the events so far. And James is just recovering from COVID. And, looks like a HCUTS visit is on the sort of agenda, James, I would have thought. HCUTS is where we've got a barbershop, mobile hydrogen fuel cell powered barbershop. And I was there. I looked like James yesterday until I walked through HCUTS. So, but look, James, it'd be really interesting to sort of just get a bit of a wrap from you about how you see all this sort of stuff fitting into the agricultural perspective.
Oh, absolutely, John. I think it's been a fascinating demystification, if you like, for me, certainly on that biodiesel versus that new, the renewable diesel piece. And I think the potential, if you like, for replacing some of that diesel or that carbon footprint that agriculture certainly is exposed to, both in logistics and indeed on our broadacre farms, I think is significant. The issues, Alan and Mel actually, address some of those principal issues, if you like, about the actual cost of producing the feedstock, if you like. I know my dad, he used to grow the chaff, if you like, with the horses. Like he'd essentially grow the chaff for the horses to grow the chaff for the horses. It was a sort of cyclical program. He knew it was crazy at the time, which was the interesting part of the equation, but he kept doing it. So essentially we've got to, the technology that we've got at the moment essentially makes it feasible, if you like, that we can actually replace some of these. With Alan saying that diesel is $5 a gallon in America, well, I could only wish for that. the three Aussie dollars per litre has really brought into perspective, if you like, our exposure to global supply chains and fuel security, if you like. And I think both speakers essentially unpack the potential of these technologies, if you like, to underpin or to risk our supply chains from international supply chains. And as you pointed out, John, yourself, essentially pulling some of that production back from that terminal in Singapore it de-risks agriculture somewhat significantly, because we have been exposed for a long time to international supply chains in a lot of our inputs. We've really seen it come to the fore with COVID, and this certainly is one of the ways we're pivoting to de-risk that, if you like. So yes, I think very interesting. I think agriculture is. There's a lot of people very concerned, about their diesel motors becoming redundant, with these new technologies. And I think these sort of exercises that you've hosted and encouraged, John, essentially put some of the, stop people being sort of spooked, if you like, too much by, this potential new future. We've got to make sure that, we've got a transitional, we've got technologies that are transitional, and those diesel motors are beautiful pieces of kit. They're certainly better than those horses. So thank you.
Good. Yeah, thanks, James. And look, hope the COVID recovery sort of keeps going well. Look, I'll invite you along. The next plan, guys, is to have a number 6, where we sort of look at a little bit more of the potential in regional development and the possibilities of, some level of independence in the world, as opposed to full reliance on imported fuel. So we'll play around with that over the next few months and let you know when it's on again. But I'm thinking somewhere around July should be a day where we can sort of find time for that. So with that, look, if there's any final comments that anybody desperately needs to make, we'll sort of just have 2 seconds to cover those. And if there's not, Natasha, we're not seeing anybody sort of screaming, waving arms or anything, so it's all good. All right. So look, with that, I'd like to thank everybody for popping in. I'd particularly like to thank Natasha and the ToCal crew for their support and organising and running the mysterious Zoom process that they do. And look, thanks to the speakers. Thanks to James, Mal, and to Alan. Alan's now going to be sort of getting sort of very late in the evening over there, and he's sort of been the most interesting sort of talk from him. So look, if you're like me, pop back and have a look at the recording, because there's sort of more than what you can sort of absorb in one sitting, I think, from what was discussed today. So thanks everybody for your time, and thanks again, speakers, and we'll see you all in a little while. So good on you.